If you're familiar with World War II, the chances are you're familiar with the Battle of the Atlantic, Germany's attempts to suffocate the Allied war effort with U-boat submarines attacking merchant shipping. It was one of the key battles of the war, but it wasn't the most successful submarine campaign. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific, the American Navy was in its own little-known battle against Japanese merchant shipping that would prove to be utterly devastating to the imperial war effort. In the years leading up to 1941, the US Navy did not intend for submarines to form the backbone of a war against Japanese merchant shipping. In fact, in 1930 the US had joined with Britain in calling for submarines to be banned under the First London Naval Treaty. This proposal never made it into international law, but American disdain for using submarines to attack civilian shipping was real and was a long way from the US Navy's thoughts in the 1930s. That's not to say they didn't plan on using submarines though. As the prospect of war with Japan came into focus in the late 1930s and early 1940s, construction of submarines was stepped up. But the new American boats like the Gato and Balao classes weren't designed for attacking merchant ships necessarily. Designated as fleet submarines, these boats were more than twice the size of their German counterparts and designed to carry a larger number of torpedoes and operate at greater range in order to attack enemy warships. Both the US and British navies did plan to interdict Japanese shipping and blockade the home islands, but with surface ships operating from forward bases at Hong Kong and Manila, not with submarines. But on December 7th, 1941, there was a change of plan. Just 4 hours after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, ordered the US Navy to execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. The Empire of Japan's war economy in 1941 was incredibly vulnerable to the disruption of its shipping, perhaps even more so than Britain's. Even before the offensives to Malaya, the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies began, Japan's merchant fleet was already burdened with carrying troops and supplies to and from China and filling the needs of much of its civilian economy. After almost all of Southeast Asia fell to Japan in 1942, it had access to all the raw materials it and its war economy could ever need, but the iron ore, bauxite, rubber and oil still needed to be transported back to Japan to be useful. Troops, aircraft, ammunition and weapons had to flow in the other direction to defend what it had taken. And a huge amount of shipping had to flow through a single area between China and the Philippines. Cut this route off, and you might be able to strangle Japan's war economy into submission. That's the theory, but in 1942 it was a distant prospect and did not rank as the US Navy's top priority. Pacific submarines under Rear Admirals Thomas Withers and then Robert English were given a wide variety of tasks in support of surface forces. Boats were sent to lay mines, conduct reconnaissance, collect weather data, and deliver supplies to beleaguered land positions, amongst other things. A lot of patrol time was also given over to trying to intercept and sink Japanese warships, their original purpose. These attacks were rarely successful. Warships were fast and hard for a submarine to catch and engage. Of 23 contacts with Japanese capital ships in 1942, only 4 resulted in damage to the enemy, with none sunk. In fact, Japan's submarines did a better job on this front. They managed to sink the carriers Yorktown and Wasp and heavily damaged the battleship North Carolina and aircraft carrier Saratoga. When not tasked to other activities, American submarines carried out good old-fashioned commerce raiding across the Western Pacific, sinking in 1942 274 merchant ships. Or at least that's what was claimed at the time. In the heat of battle, the size of ships could easily be inflated along with the number that was sunk. A post-war report by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee in 1947 put the figure for this year at 154 merchant ships sunk. Aircraft, mines and other losses accounted for a further 87 ships. Either way, it was not a strong performance for these submarines, especially when compared to German U-boats, which in the first half of 1942 alone had sunk 526 Allied ships in the Atlantic. The reasons for this underperformance were varied and not unconnected to the loss of submarine bases at the Philippines and Guam as part of a year in which the US was in retreat. But problems specific to the submarine service ran deeper than that, starting with their equipment. The standard weapon for American submarines in 1942 was the Mark 14 torpedo, which had been developed in the 1920s and was untested in combat at the start of the war. Almost as soon as the fighting began, doubt emerged over its reliability, with numerous boats reporting that it failed to explode correctly. As an example, shortly before Christmas 1941, the USS Sargo fired 8 torpedoes at 4 different targets and got no hits. Suspecting something was wrong, the boat's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Dwight Jacobs, then spent almost an hour precisely tracking a new target on December 26th. Every measurement was double and triple checked, and the boat closed to within 1,000 yards of the target before firing 4 torpedoes. All of them failed to explode. Now, Mark 14 torpedoes have 2 methods of detonation: by contact with a ship or a magnetic detonator which would be triggered as the torpedo passed underneath one. It would later emerge that both of these were defective, though the Navy was slow to acknowledge it and even slower to fix it. By the time 1942 ended, no live tests of a torpedo had taken place, and the subs would enter 1943 still with temperamental torpedoes. The American submarine fleet also experienced problems with its officers, both sub-captains that weren't aggressive enough, and the top brass that the naval historian Clay Blair argues failed to put a coherent plan together. Instead, he says, boats were too often shunted about willy-nilly on missions for which they were not suited. Blair argues that the submarine force should have been overwhelmingly focused on interdicting Japanese merchant shipping, particularly in the key area northwest of the Philippines. He records that the 54 war patrols mounted into this region were responsible for 81 sinkings, more than 40% of the total for the year. It was a pattern that Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, in command of the submarines based at Pearl Harbor, learned from. In 1943, some 50% of the patrols from Hawaii were directed to this key zone, compared to just 15% in 1942. Lockwood himself was promoted to overall command of Pacific submarines in February, after the incumbent Bob English and several other naval officers were killed in a plane crash. Lockwood oversaw a better but still inconsistent year for the submarine fleet. 335 Japanese ships were sunk by submarines, with 135 more added from other causes. It was a big rise on the previous year, and enough to start to have an impact on the imperial economy. Imports of key raw materials including coal, iron, bauxite and rice fell to 16.4 million tonnes, down from more than 20 million tonnes the previous year. The Americans were aided through 1943 by better availability of torpedoes, as the supply shortages that had plagued the previous year began to ease. But though they had more torpedoes, the Mark 14 was still not reliable, though more effort was put into fixing the issues as the year wore on. All of the defects were eventually solved by September 1943, 22 months after the war had begun. The improved fortunes of Allied submarines in 1943 did not escape the attention of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Towards the end of the year, the Japanese finally set up a dedicated force to protect its merchant shipping, the Merchant Escort Command under Admiral Koshiro Oikawa. Japan entered World War II without an effective idea of how to protect its merchant shipping. Commerce defence during a protracted, gruelling war had not formed a central part of a naval strategy which emphasised fighting a single decisive battle to emerge victorious. As such, the resources that Admiral Oikawa was able to command to protect Japan's vital shipping were meagre at best. Of the 69 destroyers that Japan possessed at the outbreak of war, 38 had been sunk by the end of 1943, so there was precious little to work with. Several classes of small escort ships were ordered, a bit like the Flower-class corvettes of the Royal Navy, but most of these were not complete until the latter half of the war. The Japanese also ramped up construction of fresh merchant ships to replace those being lost. More than 1 million tons of shipping would be constructed between April 1943 and April 1944, joined by increasing numbers of escorts as the new year approached. But unfortunately for Japan, it would not be enough to prevent what was coming. By the start of 1944, the United States Navy's Pacific submarines were reaching a very high level of efficiency. Problems with crews and torpedoes had largely been worked out. A developed system of wolf packs had been implemented, with multiple boats coordinating attacks together. Superior radar technology had been installed on many boats, and detailed information on Japanese movements was provided by ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park. Through 1944, the subs demonstrated their effectiveness against Japanese warships. They sank 1 battleship, 7 aircraft carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, and 30 destroyers. To this formidable force was added the key ingredient of new air and sea bases on the Mariana Islands of Saipan and Guam, captured in mid-1944. The Mariana Islands provided a staging base for naval and air forces that was dramatically closer to Japan's key shipping lanes than Pearl Harbor was. The impact on Japan's shipping was even more devastating than on its warships. From submarines alone, 548 merchant ships were destroyed. Another 432 sunk by other Allied combat units, mostly carrier and land-based aircraft, which could now range deep into the East China Sea. It was a devastating assault that only got worse as the year drew on. In the final months of 1944, US forces began to recapture the Philippines. With American forces now based so close, the supply route to Japan northwest of Luzon then became almost completely severed, and the ability of Japan to transport vital oil virtually stopped dead. Japanese imports for 1944 collapsed to 10 million tons, half the value it was 2 years before. The size of the empire's merchant fleet went the same way, halving from 4.1 to just 2 million tons. The impact on Japan's war economy was profound. Production of steel and aluminium fell off a cliff, and the military stockpile of vital aviation fuel dropped to critical levels. By early 1945, effectively no oil was getting through to the home islands, which meant a critical shortage of fuel to the point where the Japanese government began trying to extract oil from pine needles. In other words, according to the historian Phillips Payson O'Brien, by the time the US Air Force was even thinking about firebombing major Japanese cities, Japanese production was already in a state of terminal collapse as their ability to move raw materials and finished goods around their empire had ground to a halt. It was nothing short of the total strangulation of a war economy by air and sea, to such an extent that the submarine force actually had a quieter year in 1945, sinking only 160 ships or so. This was largely because what remained of Japan's merchant marine was bottled up in port, almost not daring to leave and being sunk anyway in large numbers by aircraft and particularly by mines which were dropped outside harbour entrances. Across the war as a whole, Japan lost more than 9 million tons of shipping, of which more than 6 million was sunk after the start of 1944. It was an extraordinary success and one of the most important victories of the Pacific War. With their war economy in ruins, the fighting of 1944 and 45 became an increasingly uphill fight for the Japanese army and navy. For example, shortages of fuel because tankers were getting sunk meant training for new Japanese pilots was continually scaled back throughout the war. Scaled back training meant inexperienced pilots getting massacred in the skies above the Philippine Sea in what became known to the US as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. However, important as it was, the battle against Japanese merchant shipping is also one of the least known battles of the Second World War. Unlike their German counterparts, the exploits of US submarines were usually secret and not reported at the time, and in the years since the war's end, historians and the public have often chosen to focus more on big decisive moments: Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. But perhaps the most decisive battle of them all was one that went on quietly under the waves and in the sky over the Pacific and brought the Japanese war economy to its knees. Next time, we're going to tell the story of one small part of this decisive battle, the story of Commander Lawson Ramage's 48-minute rampage through a Japanese convoy in the summer of 1944. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it.